Okay, let's talk about plant nutrition versus plant fertilization. So, nutrition is the availability and types of elements that are needed in plants, and fertilization is adding additional nutrients to the soil for the plant. What determines plant growth? So, the maximum amount of growth that you're going to see in a plant is going to be determined by whatever nutrient is the least available. So that means there's the least amount of it. And as explain nutrients, that'll make a little bit more sense as we keep going. So just bear with me here. Macronutrients are macro, right, is large, and they are required in pretty big quantities by the plant. Now, keep in mind, right, plants are using carbon dioxide, water, and oxygen to do photosynthesis. And that's what, and then they make sugar, and then they break down that sugar to make other things with. So when I use the word plant nutrition and plant food, keep in mind that plants are autotrophs. They make their own food. But just like we have vitamins that our bodies make and then vitamins that you have to consume, right? Plants kind of are in the same situation. So there are some macronutrients and micronutrients that plants need in order to be able to do all the things that they do. So this is the list of macronutrients. NPK, those are the first three, and those are the really big ones, right? And I'll explain more about why they're just so big in a minute. But then there's also calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. So the plant needs a pretty significant amount of each one of these things to be able to survive and grow. So if any one of these things is lacking, that's going to impact how well your plant grows. Micronutrients, micro, small, are things that are needed in much smaller quantities, and they look like this. So, boron, copper, chlorine, iron, manganese, molybdenum, sodium, and zinc. And when I mean sodium, I mean like Na as it salt. And so, all of these things, right? These are all metals except for chlorine, right, which is a gas. All the rest of these are metals. So when we're talking um, plant nutrition, the other thing that we're talking about is we're talking about what are the minerals in the ground, right, that are available to the plants. And so each place is going to have different kinds of minerals based on the soil structure of that particular place and what the geology is and how the rocks that were there were formed and then what kinds of elements are actually in the ground. So let's look at what are these things used for in the plant. So of course, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, right? All of those things, those come from either water or from the air, and those are all used in photosynthesis. But nitrogen is important for stem and leaf growth and the manufacture of chlorophyll. So having a green plant. And nitrogen comes from um, decayed organic material, right? The nitrogen cycle is really important. And that you are either going to be getting it from the soil or you're going to be getting it from some kind of fertilizer. Phosphorus and potassium are associated with the production of flowers and the production of fruit. Um, and calcium is important for cell wall regulation. Magnesium is in chlorophyll. Sulfur is part of proteins and enzymes. So all of like I have the elements listed so that then you can know like what that element is and what is it used for in the plant and then normally where does it come from. So how can you remember this? Well, there's a fun little thing called C. Hopkins Cafe is mighty good. And that is short for carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, sulfur, calcium, iron, magnesium, right? And those are all sort of the main ones, but there are those other micronutrients that we talked about. So lack of nutrients in plants can lead to, for example, discoloration of leaves, death of your leaf tissue, and stunted growth, right? So when you have plants in pots, right, which we will be having plants in pots, one of the things you have to be thinking about is that you're not replenishing your soil, and you're also continuing to pour water through it. So then thinking about what then happens to all of these macro and micronutrients that are in that pot, and how does that affect the plant over time. So too little nitrogen can cause chlorosis. Too little phosphorus, you can get purple edges on your leaves. Too little potassium, no fruit or flowers, chlorosis, brown leaf edges. So how do you correct nutrient deficiency? And the way that you can correct it is by using a fertilizer, which here's an example bag of fertilizer that has an NPK listed on the front. That's what these numbers are, the 10, 10, 10. This means nitrogen is 10, potassium is 10, and then phosphorus is 10, and then potassium is 10. So this is a balanced fertilizer, so it would be like an all-purpose fertilizer for a plant. What is a fertilizer? Well, it's anything that you add to the soil that is going to increase plant growth and the nutritional value of the plant. And there's two basic fertilizer classifications: synthetically derived and organically derived. So synthetically comes from non-living sources, rocks, right? So rocks that are ground up. And then organically derived comes from living sources, right? They break down slowly. So inorganic fertilizer, it feeds the plant, but it doesn't do anything to improve soil health and soil texture. So it's like if you're applying, and it's dissolvable in water, and it's kind of like fast food for the plant. Okay. Um, you get a big, you get a big hit of growth for the plant very quickly, but it is not long lasting. Organic fertilizer feeds the soil and the plant. And they come, and the reason why is because they take longer to break down, and it's putting things back in the soil, which also add to the microbes that are in the soil. And the microbes and the bacteria and the fungi that are in the soil are hugely important for plants. And so, feeding the soil as well as feeding the plant is really important. So, here's some examples of some organic fertilizer sources. So, animal manure, right? Like cow poop and bat poop and chicken poop, right? All of those things are super high in nitrogen, and those are all great sources for manure. Cottonseed meal, so that's cotton right there. So it's the seeds that are inside of it are ground up. Soybean meal, so same thing. It's like part of the soybean that's left over. Dried blood, so when you're slaughterhouses, right, will catch and keep that blood and then use that, and you'll buy something that's called blood meal. Ground sewage sludge. So, sewage, the solids that are in the sewer system get collected and they get turned into something called biosolids, and then they can actually be used as fertilizers. And bone meal is another one, and bones from the slaughter of animals. So that is another thing that you can have fertilizer from. There's also kelp meal, and there's also something called green sand. So there's all different kinds of sources that are plant or animal sources that can then be used to rejuvenate the soil. Here's a little list of like showing you what can go into a fertilizer. And the Green Revolution was one of the things that happened and how we kind of ended up where we are right now. And I'm just going to mention this now and we'll talk about it later. But during World War II, when we were manufacturing ammunition, one of the things we figured out that we had left over was potash. And potash is a form of potassium that is you could then use in manufacturing and synthetic fertilizer. So basically, from the making of bombs during World War II, we figured out how to make synthetic fertilizer. Up until that point, there was no such thing as a synthetic fertilizer, and this fueled basically big agribusiness. And it's called the Green Revolution because suddenly you could double or triple the output of a farm by applying this synthetically derived um, fertilizer on it. So, kind of caused a big shift in all of those things.